You've probably heard of the Apostle Paul. I mean, he's a giant in Christianity, right? His letters make up a huge chunk of the New Testament. But there's a catch. We're going to dive into the 13 letters with his name on them because there's a textual mystery here that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries.
And that mystery? It all comes down to this one really big question. It's a debate that honestly opens up this incredible window into what the early church was really like. It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about authorship and, authenticity back in the ancient world.
Okay, so scholars have basically sorted these 13 letters into two piles. On one side, you've got the 7 undisputed letters. Pretty much everyone agrees, yep, that's Paul. But on the other side, we've got 6 letters that are the subject of some pretty intense debate. And the differences between these two groups, well, that's exactly what we're here to investigate. All right, here's our game plan. We'll set the stage, then dig into the 3 big clues that make people question things: the author's voice, the message, and the historical setting. Then we'll flip the script and look at the case for Paul. And finally, we'll talk about why this whole debate actually matters. It's not just for academics, I promise. So for a long time, people reading these letters in the original Greek started noticing things. Little inconsistencies. The letters in that disputed pile just felt different. The words were different, the style was different, even the core ideas seemed to have shifted. And that's what kicked off this deep, fascinating debate about who really wrote them.
So, our first piece of evidence is all about the author's textual fingerprints. It's a field called stylometry, which is just a fancy way of saying we're analyzing the writing style, the vocabulary, how sentences are built, all the little ticks that make a writer sound like themselves.
And a really key tool for these textual detectives is something called hapax legomena. It sounds complicated, but it's a Greek phrase for a super simple idea. It's a word that an author only uses one time. And these unique words, they can be a massive clue. Okay, check out this number, 306. What's so special about it? Well, that's how many words show up in what are called the pastoral letters, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that appear, get this, nowhere else in any of Paul's other writings. That is a seriously high number. It's something you just can't ignore. And this chart really puts that number into perspective. We're talking about over a third of the entire vocabulary in the pastorals being completely unique to just those 3 letters. Now, if you're a language analyst, that's a huge red flag. It practically screams that a different author might be holding the pen. But it's not just about the words themselves, it's the whole vibe. The undisputed letters, like Galatians, they feel raw, passionate, almost like Paul is dictating them in a hurry to put out a fire. The sentences are urgent, sometimes a little messy. But then you read the disputed letters, like Ephesians, and it's a different world. It's formal, it's polished. The Greek has these incredibly long, elaborate sentences. It feels less like a spontaneous letter and more like a carefully crafted theological essay. Okay, so that's clue number 1. Clue number 2 is about a shift in the substance itself. It's not just how it's written that changes, it's the core ideas, the theology. And scholars point to some really significant differences between the 2 sets of letters here. Let's take the Greek word pistis, which we translate as faith. In Paul's undisputed letters, it almost always means a person's individual trust in Christ. It's a relationship. But in the pastorals, the meaning changes. It becomes the faith, like a set body of teachings, the official Christian religion. It's a subtle change, but wow, it's a profound one. And you see the same kind of thing with church structure. In the undisputed letters like Corinthians, Paul talks about a community that's really led by the Spirit. You have roles like apostles and prophets. There's no talk about a rigid formal hierarchy. But then you jump to the pastorals and suddenly the focus is all about establishing church offices with these detailed lists of qualifications for bishops and deacons. This points to a much more developed institutional church, something from a later time perhaps. And that idea of a later time brings us right to our third clue, the historical setting. The 2 sets of letters, they just seem to be written for completely different moments in the life of the early church. They're trying to solve very different problems. Paul's undisputed letters are what you'd call occasional. They're written to deal with specific, immediate problems. For instance, he's arguing with other Jewish Christians about the role of the Mosaic Law. But the disputed letters? They're warning against these strange heresies about myths and endless genealogies, which sounds a lot like Gnosticism, a movement that really took off in the 2nd century, not the 1st.
And on top of all that, if you try to map out Paul's travels based on letters like Titus and 1 Timothy, it's almost impossible to make them fit the timeline of his life we get from the book of Acts. And then there are these really subtle rhetorical clues. One is this fascinating concept scholars call the anxiety of fiction. So in 2 Thessalonians, the author basically stops and says, hey, look, this is really me writing this. See my signature. But Paul never does that in his undisputed letters. He doesn't have to. And that kind of defensive move, that over-prostation of genuineness, can actually be a dead giveaway of a forgery.
Okay, so that's a pretty compelling case, right? But this debate is far from over. So let's be fair and look at the other side. The arguments for why Paul could have written all 13 of these letters despite all these differences.
Defenders have some really strong points. First, Paul used secretaries, or amanuenses, to actually write down his letters, so different scribes could totally explain the changes in style. Second, you have to think about the audience. Of course, he would use different language when writing to a trusted friend about church business versus writing to an entire congregation about deep theology. And finally, people change. It's entirely possible that Paul's own thinking, his own style, just evolved over his long career. And this brings up one of the most clever counterarguments out there. Think about it. If you were trying to forge a letter from someone as famous as Paul, wouldn't you try your absolute best to copy his style perfectly? The fact that the disputed letters are so different could, paradoxically, be a sign they aren't forgeries. A good forger would have been a much better mimic. So, we've looked at the evidence for and against. But you might be wondering, so what? Why does this matter? Well, this isn't just about winning some ancient historical argument. What we decide here tells us something really profound about the birth of Christianity itself.
Because here's the thing. Whether these letters were written by one guy or by a bunch of people carrying on his legacy, they all, together, tell a story. They give us this incredible, almost real-time snapshot of a religion finding its feet.
And that story is a story of evolution. It's the story of a shift from a charismatic, spirit-led movement built around these incredible figures like Paul to a more structured, institutional religion that's focused on preserving tradition and setting up leadership. And the letters, they capture that evolution as it's happening.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. See, in the ancient world, writing in the name of your revered teacher wasn't always seen as deception. It could be a way of honoring them, of carrying their legacy forward. So it forces us to ask, what does authentic really mean? Does a text's power come from who physically held the pen, or from the ideas it has carried through 2,000 years of history?